And another way of putting all this, he talks about this on page 29, the next page. He says, but the levels of being have increasing what he calls indeterminacy, which is a very good word, especially when there's people who believe that we're all determined, that everything is cause and effect, right? So he says that we have this progression, we have this passivity to activity, or what he calls necessity to freedom. So the lowest level, the matter level, acts only by necessity. So it always requires an outside force to move it. It has no possibility of developing. It has no choice. It has no way of changing its own nature. Okay, so it is fully determined. There is no indeterminacy. And there's no freedom, of course. And this is what he calls a capacity for free action, is what he calls an inner space. And as you go up the levels of being, there is more and more inner space, in the sense that there's more room for freedom. There's more room for indeterminacy. And so when he talks about life, he says that there is a little inner space in life, and which is for plants, and animals have more inner space for more complicated reactions to stimulus, and of course that's where that motive thing comes in. And then he says on page 30 that, and I guess it's kind of what I was discussing earlier about capacity for will, and people may be kind of different in their willpower. He says, only when a man makes use of his power of self-awareness does he attain to the level of a person, to the level of freedom. At that moment, he is living, not being lived. So he's saying that when someone is kind of just being taken up by the moment and being controlled by other people, or controlled by their environment, or addicted to something, or those people are being lived, like they're being used, right? Something else is kind of controlling them. They are not living. They're not acting in accordance with their self-awareness and their freedom and their autonomy and things like that. And he says that, and again, there's this movement towards this higher being, right? I was noticing when I was reading this many pages ago, but so he's saying that a person, we could think of a person being fully in control of themselves and fully actualizing their free will when they are able to control their environment and do what they want to do and resist influences and causes to their behavior, and always calculate and fully understand and intelligently make choices and act in accordance with their environment, not be strict, not be stimulus response. And then so he says, okay, what could be further than that? So he says, it is possible to imagine a perfect being who is always and invariably exercising its power of self-awareness, which is the power of freedom, to the fullest degree, unmoved by any necessity. This would be a divine being, an almighty and sovereign power of perfect unity. And so it reminds me of what the ancient Greeks used to say, is that leisure time is acting in a godly manner. Is that when we're not pressed to survive, right? When we're not simply trying to act like an animal or a plant to try to get along, if we are able to choose to do activities for higher purposes, like thinking or reading or learning and things like that, then we are acting more and more like a free being, a free man. And that the abstraction then is that a being who never requires to act out of necessity and lives like a privileged person who has no responsibilities, that is a divine existence, because that person is always acting. They're doing what they want every day, but we have to be careful there, because someone who does whatever they want every day is not necessarily living like a high being, because they could simply be wasting their time or drinking or doing drugs, and those are more animalistic behaviors. Those are just more cause and effect. Someone who instead would pursue higher things would be someone who we would aspire to be in terms of a higher free being. He also makes the point about if you take the 4 levels of being, there's also this progression toward integration and unity, and that means being all of your parts being integrated and functioning together, aligned. And so he says a matter has no integration whatsoever, and you can break it apart, you can make it into dust, you can scatter it across the universe, and it doesn't change its properties. It has no capacity of integration, so if you destroy it, everything stays the same. It's just smaller, right? So it has zero capacity. A plant has a very weak capacity of integration in terms of what it can do with its entire self, right? But even with a plant, you could cut off pieces of it and grow, and they could continue to grow. Just like a rock, you could cut it up and it would still be rock, right? So a plant has very weak connections, a weak integration. An animal has more integration in terms of you can't simply cut it up. An animal will not persist. An animal leg or an animal ear will not persist as an animal, right? But again, the animal has a very weak, he says, very modest level of logicality and consistency. Its memory on the whole is weak, and its intellect shadowy. But a man is definitely a kind of biological system where everything's in symbiosis, and it is the route to higher things. And he says that through psychology and through education, one can improve one's integration and one's happiness or well-being or kind of comfortableness with oneself, and that one of the tasks of life for self-aware being is to become more comfortable with their parts and their thinking and their decision-making and things like that, in a sense to kind of learn to use their willpower.